Welcome everybody to the lecture in the Calvert History Comes 350th lecture series. We have a great speaker tonight who we'll get to in just a minute. I'd like to thank you all for being flexible and changing our venue. We realized late in the program that we would be getting a big crowd, so we wanted to just move it to where we could accommodate more people. I'd like to thank the town of North Beach for being so gracious and helping us out. Mayor Mark Frazier is in the back of the room. Hi, Mark. And I'd like to thank Stacy Wilkinson for helping us with the refreshments. Sorry, Stacy Wilkerson for helping with the refreshments. I'd also like to thank the North Beach Senior Center folks because they pitched in with their site pretty much at the last minute, and in particular that would be Maureen Hoffman, who's the Director of Community Resources, Tina Dubis, who's the Director of the Senior Center and agreed to this right away, Ricka Baker and Linda Hoffman, who work here, and Brenda Jacks, who's here tonight to help us. I guess I'd like to introduce myself as well. I'm Pat Hoffman. I'm the Director of the Library. We do have two other elected officials here with us this evening that I'd like to introduce to you. Two members of the North Beach Town Council, and one is Gary Pendleton. And Michael Bojangles. Did any others come in that I missed? No. See, I'd like to tell you about a couple of things that are coming up. One thing that's coming up for the 350th anniversary is a time capsule, and there's flyers here this evening about the time capsule. The people who are at the flyers table, raise your hand. So there's flyers over there, and please take a look before you leave. The time capsule should be very interesting, and the committee is looking for suggestions right now of what to put in the time capsule so you could actually take a part in that and have part of that, the operation for that. The next lecture in the 350th lecture series will be on Thursday, March 11th, when Grace Mary Brady will be talking about women of Calvert County at the Fairview Library. So I hope you all have that on your calendars. The library is also sponsoring a poetry contest for the 350th anniversary with the theme of Calvert Heritage. And people from 8 years old through adults are able to participate in that. And the information about that is here this evening as well at the flyers table. I would like to thank the Arts Council and the Friends of the Library for co-sponsoring that with us. I'd also like to point your attention to a special event that's coming up on Saturday, February 21st. We have a special program in the Performing Arts Series, Tom Wisner and Friends, and this should be a lot of fun at Calvert High School. And Tom Wisner happens to be here with us this evening. So, okay. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Kent Mountford. He's a scientist, author, and a professional speaker. He lectures on how history impacts our lives today, and he is noted to speak throughout the Atlantic seaboard states. He's an estuarine ecologist and environmental historian who is widely published with articles and one book that he does have here. This book is Close Sea. It was written about Barnegat Bay in New Jersey and published in 2002. He will be telling you more about himself. I would like to say a couple of things on a personal note about Kent. He's been a sailor for over 50 years and a licensed U.S. Coast Guard captain since 1987. His half-century of logbooks filled with experiences and sketches cover some 35,000 miles, sailing in his own boats and those of others across waters domestic and foreign. He lives on one of the bay's most beautiful tributaries, and from an office overlooking his boat moored in her cove, now writes, lectures about, and studies Chesapeake history and ecology full-time. And when I read that about his logbook, I said to myself, that must be another book waiting to happen. So his topic tonight sounds like a lot of fun and very interesting, and I know you're all here to hear that. So outhouse to in-house, Dr. Kent Mountford.
it's always unwise to clap before, because you have to. And I expected to thank both of you for coming, but boy, what a turnout. I'm really astounded by this, and I hope it's not what you expect. All right, everybody kill the lights, and I'll say goodnight to those of you who are around. We do have to turn the projector on. Ralph, you know that trick. No, the lights aren't on. Bring up the switch. If it's on, the bulb is burned out. There you go. Is it all the way up now? I was in my office here on the night of the last election and noticed my voicemail light was blinking. It was Nelson Hernandez from the Washington Post who was doing a story on colonial outhouses, and honestly, that night he was headed for a lecture in College Park on the subject by Professor Michael Olmertz at the University of Maryland. I thought I had a corner on this market, but it doesn't seem it. It certainly proves that at each election time there's a lot of crap flying around. Well, I said that Nelson could quote me since my political connections are nil nowadays, but his article opened kind of a tempest in the toity, with phone calls, emails, counter articles in the Post for about a month. And everyone who called or spoke with me has added another outhouse story to the pot, so to speak. This presentation, you will notice, uses the very best audio-visual technology from the 1970s, and this assures smooth delivery here at the juncture of the new millennium. The no hookup delays, unresponsive cursors, unresponsive computers, PowerPoint glitches. Thank you. But it does present this author's very special, unique vision. No laughing now, it's my vision. On topics not usually covered in blending the Chesapeake's past with her many and present problems. Well, this talk has a generous genesis, if you will, with an invitation to speak in a lecture series at Pennsylvania's Renfrew Institute up in Waynesboro on the history of Chesapeake Basin farm structures, about which I know virtually nothing. About the same level of expertise, I think, on farm buildings as I have on roadkills, although some of you know that I have a talk on roadkills that I give as well, based on a whimsical car window highway survey that we did over a number of years. And people, as a result of that, have sent me scores of items, legal decisions, recipes, menus for roadkills, to the point where I know a lot more about that than you do. So I'm working toward the same objective with outhouses, following a presumptuous column that I wrote for the publishers of Bay Journal back in 2001. So I expect after each delivery of this talk to be inundated with new and exciting factoids about outhouses. That's already happening, and much to the humor and wisdom that's come out of that is sort of integrated into the text of this talk. Last time there was a news clipping about it that got in one of the national newspapers. I got a CD from a music group in the far west out in Arizona called Under the Crescent Moon. And the name of the group is the Privy Tippers. And I tried to get, like, where do you get this thing? And they never responded by email. I was going to be able to sell them in my talk. Well, later I'll offer some alternatives to the wasteful toilets that all of you will be grateful that you used before coming to hear this interminable presentation. Well, where am I coming from makes me an authority on this subject. I come from Lusby. Now, most audiences I talk about this say, well, what the heck is Lusby? But you know, in Danish, it means village of lights, Lusby. And I think Morris and Charlie Lusby in our county here would really be pleased to hear that about their family name. But we Lusbians all take great umbrage that people haven't taken the time to learn about us. If you get out your Maryland road maps, you'll find Lusby right here between Crapo on the east, which should bring out a mind. And if you're having trouble finding the appropriate parts, that's down near Crocheron, south of the Hunger River. And the ways to the west of Lusby is beautiful Pisgah. And I'm sure you've got the location pretty clear now, but while we have the Pisgah AME up here, it's useful to note that this problem of human waste goes back many thousands of years. And the Reverend Paul Resbass, who married me all 33 years, I think it is, Nance, ago, got this citation for me from Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. When thou wilt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt, and you have to assume the words take a spade, Dig therewith, and thou shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. So the process goes back a long way, and the process of handling one's waste is an important one. With that context, let's come forward to my home metropolis of Lusby in the last century. When we moved to Catchall about 3 decades ago, Calvert County in southern Maryland was a very different place than it is today. The census indicated that there were 71 old abandoned farmhouses within the boundaries of the county, and many score of occupied dwellings still had outhouses, not toilets. During the first half of the 20th century, most of America gained the convenience of indoor plumbing, and those who had more primitive facilities were considered therefore less fortunate and became, forgive the pun, the butt of many jokes. Jokes which would be lost on most people in the present generation who never experienced corn cobs as predecessors to toilet tissue. And I said that the brown cobs were used first, and then a white one to see if another brown one was needed. Well, to modern residents, the pathos of a personal valuable lost down that dark, unsavory hole doesn't really, resonate, doesn't have much cause to give empathy. But people would understand the rigors of their trips to the jigs. Now, that term, incidentally, is of unknown etymology, but it dates back to at least 1528 as one of about 30 names applied to these facilities. There was, of course, the midnight alternative, chamber pot, here modeled by Tammy, who's an interpreter up at the Renfrew Institute. It's a fine piece of 1860 antebellum mocaware. It slid like a drawer beneath a carved chair seat, and the whole apparatus in turn slid under the bed. Now, a lady near Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, acquired one of these at a yard sale, having no idea what its original purpose was. Served up a piping hot shrimp creole. She was, of course, puzzled why so little of her tasty dish was consumed. I thought it was a pretty cool move myself. Well, you all had dinner, right? Catchall, our place in Maryland, was in the early 1970s still isolated on a gravel track back a mile from the nearest paved road. It made the transition to indoor plumbing after a fashion with a vintage porcelain toilet. Now, David Pillsbury Allen, who had done that, did the work himself, like many local people in the time, mid-1930s, when dollars were short and rural plumbing codes were unheard of. Both the soil pipe and the toilet, like everything else in the house, were certainly salvaged from some other older and demolished building. The cast iron soil pipe that Dave had was several inches too long, with the result that the bowl sitting atop it had to be perched on a shelf several inches above the floor. The toilet, thus oddly elevated, as you see in my sketch, sat, and so did you, directly in front of a window, looking out over about a mile of scenic St. Leonard Creek. Now, in the 1930s, boat traffic on the creek was negligible, but by the 1970s, with the explosion in recreational yachting, sitting atop that toilet after dark on a summer's evening with a light on, put one directly in view of any number of weekend boaters partying in their cockpit. I wouldn't risk applause on arising from this elevated throne before an often inebriated audience, because the terms. Now, Dave Allen was nonetheless far ahead of his time at Catchall, separating sewage and domestic gray water that emanated from our sinks and washing machine. And he's thus sparing the septic tank and its balanced bacterial flora that's so important from grease and household chemicals. Now, his forward thinking, however, included the conduct of this gray water waste and its load of high phosphate detergent down the 38-foot adjacent cliff. There was distributed directly into the creek through a cast iron pipe manifold. This had worked for decades, unobtrusively and unbeknownst to us. During our first winter at Catchall, heavy rains and repeated freeze-thaw cycles that are so common in our Calvert cliffs caused a large section of the cliff collapse into the estuary, along with a massive old locust tree against which I had been leaning the very night before. Unfortunately, the tree's roots also carried away the larger part of Dave Allen's 1930 vintage gray water piping. Well, one Saturday morning, the next spring, having put the week's laundry into wash, I went out to look at several pleasure boats anchored beneath the cliff and waved gaily from my from my position of elevated and privileged view. As I stood there, the washer went into a roaring spin cycle, and suddenly beneath my feet, spouting out, I'm backed up there one, spouting out about 4 feet into the air came a flood of hot sudsy water discharging from the stump of that pipe. Now, that font of pollution cascaded down the cliff noisily and seemingly forever into the creek and left this plume of foam drifting out past the anchored boats on the ebb tide. Well, for a long time thereafter, doing the wash was a clandestine nighttime affair. When eventually we managed to purchase this place, including the largest mortgage in the Western world at the time, the primitive plumbing was corrected, the separation of grain water was maintained, and of course we use phosphate-free detergents today, like everybody else in the county, or at least should be. Human waste has been a problem, as I intimated before, over many centuries. This is a protruding attachment on a castle at St. Michael's Mount in the south of England. Similar structures were used as garderobes or privies, and I've seen them perch on castles as far east as the Saimaa district in Finland, close to what was once the border with the Soviet Union. Native Americans handled their waste very matter-of-factly, simply depositing wherever the need occasioned. But with the European interlopers, waste disposal quickly became a serious problem, even for rural dwellers like the earliest colonists who arrived here in the mid-Atlantic. Consider 180 men at Jamestown with the poor sanitary practices and non-existent personal hygiene in the 17th century English, packed into a sweltering, treeless fort that first year. 180 men, furthermore, with dysentery. 17th century sanitation was conducted with, to put it frankly, no understanding of the germ theory of disease, a concept that would have to await further development of the scientific method and employment of a microscope, along with Louis Pasteur's mid-19th century confirmation of bacterial infection. The term bacterium doesn't even seem to have come into the English language until after the middle of the 19th century. That kind of surprised me, but it seems to be the case. Little wonder that of those 180 Virginia colonists, only 38 of them were alive at the end of the first year. But the supply of victims was virtually infinite. It was replenished with each arriving vessel with a new contingent of equally unenlightened people. So the Virginia colony, planted with such hope, was a walking disaster by 1610. May 24th of that year, the new governor, Sir Thomas Gates, promulgated severe regulations to restore it to order. From among many tight restrictions and severe punishment, emerged the following proclamation entitled, Articles, Laws, Divine, Politic, and Martial for the Colony of Virginia. And it reads in small part, Nor shall any one aforesaid within less than 1/4 of 1 mile from the palisado, which is the wall of the fort, the log palisade around it, dare to do the necessities of nature, since by these unmanly, slothful, and loathsome immodesties the whole fort may be choked and poisoned with ill airs. My wife would claim that I still do that. But so corrupt, as in all reason cannot but much infect the fort. And this they shall take notice of and avoid upon pain of whipping. And further punishment as shall be thought meet by censure of a martial court. Well, Sir Thomas's toilet police spoke with certain severity there, enough I think to constipate all but the most urgent needs. The colonists, however, the guys who lived in that fort, were within a rock and a hard place in this regard, because not unfrequently unaccompanied men out to attend the necessities of nature a 1/4 mile from the fort came scampering back painfully wounded by arrows, or were killed outright by the Indians and were returned only for burial. And armor was hardly the ideal clothing in which to make one's toilet. So the digging of privies, let's define them as crude pits in which human waste and other trash were deposited, soon became a hallmark of colonial settlement sites, especially as plantations began to proliferate up and down Virginia's tributary streams. This is all pre-Maryland, guys, remember that. Now, modern archaeologists love old privies because they're extraordinary time capsules. I'm sorry about the deer antler in there, Wayne, but this is the only excavation I had a photo of. So you'll probably remember that particular pit. The septic wastes, of course, are long since gone to good compost. But other items, such as the stem of a pipe broken off and tossed in, or a coin dropped accidentally, vintage bottles like this laudanum vial, shards of broken crockery, even oyster shells with a peculiar or particular shape or sign provide clues to enable precise dating. Each layer marks a passage in human habitation, and often, say, the very top layer can be dated exactly as when a plantation house is known to burn in the winter of a particular year. Well, I thought these losses into the pits would be a kind of a unique signal for bygone eras, but I heard a piece on NPR just several weeks ago that in England some 600,000 cell phones have been dropped into the nation's toilets. And well, it's a new source of archaeological material, I guess. Well, back to the colonial perspective. It's also notable, privies aside, that the outside corners of many earlier colonial buildings and their doorways are often distinguished by different chemistry in the soil, which is a signal that wastes of various kinds were often intentionally deposited there, or with respect to the door, they were only as distant as far as they could be conveniently tossed. Well, a couple of privies were excavated at the Royer Household Farm up in Waynesboro, and a very careful and useful piece of work it was, revealing items as disparate as a china doll and a brass pistol. A gun? Mom, what gun? I can't imagine losing a brass pistol down the blue. But anyway, it was nice to see that folks there from about 1830 to 1850, the period of habitation, were making good use of the local flora in their diets. Full 21 species showed up, including tomato seeds, which was not thought to be a food item in Pennsylvania that early. It was considered poisonous at an earlier time. But almost dominant, the most abundant thing, were the seeds of the native or foxgrape, which you see here. Jamestown colonists had quickly utilized that resource themselves and spoke of a very acceptable wine that they'd made from it and how abundant they were. John Smith wrote that these were immense vines that rose up to the canopy of the trees in the virgin forest, and they could be as great as a man's thigh. Now, this vine is 75 years old. It's in modern southern Maryland. The thigh adjacent is about 42 years old. It wasn't quite clear how they got the grapes down, but of course this vine responds very quickly to culture, and that would only be a problem getting them down from the trees for wild-gathered grapes. So I guess they were sort of domesticated, and they made pretty good product. As the Chesapeake was settled more densely, it was more and more likely that a privy would be dug too close to a shallow well. And that travel through the groundwater would contaminate drinking water with pathogens from sick residents or neighbors. Now, this was no prerogative to the colonies. Thousands died throughout urban Europe from waste-borne cholera into the middle 19th century. At Plymouth in Pennsylvania in 1855, the excreta of a typhoid patient were cast out on the snow, and when this melted in the January thaw or whatever, it contaminated the town water supply. And from this pollution, 1,104 people were sickened and 104 of them died from one case. In America, imported Asiatic cholera was likewise pernicious, and even anthrax was believed to be transmitted by improperly disposed waste as well as mail. The lesson was slow to be learned. When Tracy Holliday, she was the gal at the opening slide, and her family moved into their 200-year-old house in 1986, the former residents were using the privy, and they were using that privy just 70 feet from their hand-dug well and pump. At the end of George Washington's Mount Vernon garden, you can see the necessary reconstructed here in a pattern followed in many wealthier American homes well into the 19th century. 18th century privies at the larger plantations were nicely built and permanent structures. William Penn, who lived both in the 17th and 18th century, he straddled them, had a fine brick convenience, and many times in other places, both servants and slaves had proper facilities too, sometimes over the same pit, but of course for the privacy of the owners, entering through a second rear door. William Byrd II had a six-holer on his estate down by the James River, arranged in a semicircle so one could keep an eye on your fellow visitors at labor, with a small fireplace set to ease the hardships of winter in the middle of that semicircle. Now, he called this collective seat of ease the cloaca maximum, after the great sewer, which in antiquity had served the city of Rome. There are a few other rare 18th century survivors, a couple in Chester County and one in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. Outhouse historian Ronald S. Barlow says that the familiar crescent moon-shaped vent in outhouse doors was originally the universal Luna symbol for ladies. So it was the ladies' room in a largely illiterate society. And that the men's facility was noted by a sunburst or star-shaped vent. I haven't found one of them yet. Now, I'm uncertain what this particularly symbol referred either to a popular food item bound for deposit at here, or an ailment likely to be contracted at the adjacent sleeping establishment. I saw that. I went back to steal this door, and it was gone. I couldn't bear to think of it wasted, but it's in somebody's barn somewhere. Near water around the Chesapeake was to get waste immediately into the creek or a bay, probably the same in this community. Since it was viewed as a non-potable and non-drinkable water supply, and the tide would, after all, take it all away, then there'd be no problem. Now, my friend, retired Senator Bernie Fowler, along one of the bay's fiercest defenders, spoke to me about crabbing back in the 1940s when they were harvesting the rich underwater grass beds along Patuxent River's Broome Island. Everybody, Bernie said, in those days had outhouses on the end of the dock, and as I'd pull along quietly in the early morning looking for crab peelers, you could hear from the end of one dock after another, and he kind of hesitates, embarrassed, plop, 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 right into the river. He said, that's just the way it was done then. The original privy location at our place, Cattrall, from the time of its construction in the 19th century, right at the turn of the century, is unknown. There is one place where the grass grows like crazy. But when Dave Allen arrived in southern Maryland, our country was still deep in the Great Depression. During that time, much of rural America still had poor and often unsafe sanitation. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, part of his program was farm relief. And in this context, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, sent unemployed guys around rebuilding and reciting, by 1945, a total of 2.3 million privies, mostly in the American South. There were many variations in design, some put out by federal officials, others, for example, by the Ohio and North Carolina state governments. One of the philosophies was to get some distance from these occasionally odoriferous facilities. Sorry, my voice is breaking down here. Here was one recommendation, although some users with sensitive noses seem to have taken it to extreme, and something I would like to face in the middle of a winter gale. That's an awful long way. As early as 1922, the U.S. Department of Agriculture put out Farmer's Bulletin 1227, Sewage and Sewerage of Farm Homes by engineer George M. Warren, effectively emphasized the importance of home sanitation. Even from our sophisticated, we think, 21st century perspective, it's a pretty good job, and it provides a lot of basic theory, siting recommendations, and construction plans for several versions designed to fit different kinds of environments. This is their plan for a simple pit-type privy, which was eventually, essentially just set up over a hole in the ground. And when this, after some reasonable period, was filled, they simply dragged the privy to another hole dug for the same purpose. Sometimes the whole thing was abandoned and either let just fall into ruin or maybe used as a repository for refuse, to the delight of subsequent privy diggers, bottle hunters, and archaeologists. Back in 1974, the alternative to our quasi-public toilet, which I discussed on the platform, was a still functional outhouse, a two-holer, permitting serious conversation with a companion while that serious business. I could never imagine that. We just live in a different world. Well, the loo occupied just 25% of it, was compartmented from a very fine garden shed. This is a building style known as a bump-out privy. In other words, it's attached and sticking out the back of. I'm told by Alan's daughter, Mary DeHaven DeCock, who used to be librarian at the high school in this county, that for the dedication of this outhouse, 2 hymns were suggested. How firm a foundation, and I need thee every hour. Quality work as they were, Dave Allen's seats of ease did not discharge into a simple cesspit either. On page 15 of Bulletin 1227 is a 2-seat vault privy, very close to the one that he constructed at our place, with a hinged door at the back for periodic clean-out. Farmers were told again by USDA that the fertilizer value of 1 year's privy output, they estimate 730 pounds of composted material, was worth $10 gold in 1871. It was about 1/3 the potency of the best commercial bat guano. Now, I'm sure this would be useful to most of you as gardeners. I wasn't sure that that was very appropriate to bring up in this day and age, but in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago, Ashley Chapman wrote an article that says that bat guano is indeed vacuumed up in caves, and there's a California distributor who's now selling 100 tons of it annually at an average of $10 a pound. So I guess it's a pretty good comparison. Back at Privy, Dave Allen modified USDA's design by connecting his vault to a drain field with 3 seepage pits so that his system worked very much like the quote modern septic tank and needed very little maintenance, save a bit of lime tossed in from a bucket, which was still sitting there when we came to the place 4 decades later. Power failures don't trouble us at all. An alternative to lime in many sanitary privies was sifted cook stove ash, a convenient way to get rid of another household waste. Either one served to cover solids, control odor, visiting insects were inhibited, and it aided in the chemical breakdown of deposited materials. Inspection of the catch-all privy vault in true archaeological fashion revealed a number of old wine and liquor bottles still floating there, evidence of Dave's predilection for tipping a flask against the autumn chill while at his work. Well, the hankering for indoor plumbing, especially in the winter, was far from new. Biblical King Eglon of Moab was murdered while using an indoor upstairs privy chamber, sort of a Alfred Hitchcock predecessor. And archaeologists have found indoor seats of ease dating back 7,500 years. Many Greek and Roman toilet systems have been unearthed in which the wastes were carried off by flowing water. The Roman baths at Agrippinae had over 260 marble seats installed about 140 AD. Talk about company. Now, the garter robes I mentioned, the free-fall purviews similar to those that Bernie Fowler described on the river, overhung the moats of many medieval European castles, and one presumes that along with slings, arrows, and boiling oil, they were a disincentive to people getting across the moat. Something else, you had 500 or 600 troops, you could do a pretty good job of bombing people. Well, the concept of an inside flush toilet, a little bit more primitive than this, was introduced to England back in 1596 by none other than John Harrington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I. Sir John wrote a similar, a humorous manual for its use, which he called The Metamorphoses of Ajax, which the Queen really enjoyed, and she had it bound and chained to the wall of her closet chamber for the convenience and amusement of users. Sir John may in fact be the source of that expression, which is still current in Anglo-Saxon society, going to the John. Somewhat later, the Vicar of Dorsetshire, England, the Reverend Henry Moole, patented an indoor earth closet, a commode in which dry soil or ashes were sifted over and helped dehydrate fecal material, which is about 3/4 water. I'm sure you'll take that one home with you. This was claimed by Reverend Moole to render them odorless. Each human adult, let's say, deposits about 2 pounds a day. And over the long term, this residue, when composted, he claimed a perfectly acceptable and sanitized product for garden fertilizer, makes the vegetables special. Actually, some pathogens may survive this process. It's not recommended today. But because the earth closet filled, you had to carry it downstairs and store the residues outside, or your servants had to do it. And these units never gained very wide use. Reverend Moore's patented system faced a competing principle in British society that harked back to Harrington, even the Romans flushing it all away. Sir Thomas Crapper was knighted directly as a consequence for his contributions to sanitation during the 1880s. He was, as his literature said, provider of toilets, bidets, and urinals to many houses of the British royal family. His company named T. Crapper and Sons was fired into the porcelain of all his products and became synonymous with the apparatus. Sir Thomas, of course, needs no further explanation for his place in vulgar English, you would think. But the word crap means trash and goes back much further in English lexicon. So it's kind of a mixed story. We're not really sure about Sir Thomas. Now, in Calvert County, the first flush toilet was apparently installed by Frederick Beretta, the importer of guano, incidentally, who built a mansion above Drum Point at the mouth of the Tuxon. Paul Berry and Robert Hurry at the Calvert Marine Museum passed on drawings to me just last week of the Beretta mansion, in which there are a couple of flush toilets. Now, these toilets appeared in the Sears Roebuck catalogs as early as 1902. They were there indexed as closets or Philadelphia hoppers. Now, isn't that a great statement for the system of Philadelphia? I think this is what Beretta had. The Philadelphia hopper is that one. It's really not different from a funnel. But they sold from $1.25 to $10.50 for the real luxury models. And real popularity of the porcelain flush toilet did not come home to America until American servicemen returned from World War I in Europe, where they were in wider use. And the one they brought back in symbol with them is a siphon jet bowl of this vintage, which is the same thing we had at Catchall when we moved in. The problem with these and most modern toilets is their design uses and wastes a great deal of otherwise perfectly good drinking water. In municipal systems, this assembled flow moves things along through sluggish understreet piping, but the more dilute the waste stream, the more water added, the more difficult and costly it is to treat before discharge back to the environment, and in our case, Chesapeake Bay, or the Patuxent, or the Choptank, or the James, or the Rappahannock, whatever. And like on the coast, Tom, right? There's a new song there for you. The same problem occurs in conventional on-site, waste septic systems. The larger volume of water relative to the actual waste, some people estimate about 140 gallons a day go into municipal or private systems per person. You have to have all the solids and sludges removed, and the water must then be introduced to the groundwater table around the house if you have a septic system. And that's something that the old back house did without any minimal impact, really. It was a very small impact on the system. Septic tanks are used in most rural situations, which work okay for solids when they're maintained, that is, having the residual unmetabolized sludges pumped out every year. This is my guy. You know this family. They do a wonderful job. They're clean, efficient, and inexpensive. They're wonderful people. But they do this, or you should have it done to your septic tanks, so the materials don't overflow and plug the drain field pipes, in which case you get a real problem. And the natural bacterial processes in a septic tank rapidly put an end to many of the pathogens. Still, the concentration of dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus, two serious pollutants in Chesapeake Bay, in the resulting effluent from a septic tank is very high as it enters the drain field. Now, phosphorus, one of the two nutrients, absorbs, it sticks to the particles of soil until the soil is eventually saturated or coated with phosphorus. And it's quite effective at removing phosphorus for many, many years. The nitrogen, however, is likely to move on with the groundwater, potentially contaminating drinking water wells where there are shallow aquifers. when the nitrogen concentration in groundwater, or well water specifically, reaches 10 milligrams per liter, it's considered a health hazard for human infants. Alas, maybe the simplest solution is to follow Pam's experience here. Those of you in the back have problems seeing this, but poor Pam, her companions, traveling companions, knew that she'd taken a pee in the bushes, so they drew that on this shack over on Taylor's Island. I'm surprised she didn't come back with a can of white paint and cover that one up. Well, nitrogen in groundwater also moves pretty much inexorably, and once it's in the water table, largely unchanged towards streams and the bay. The tens of thousands of older homes, furthermore, that are sited with pleasing views and whatnot along the watercourses, have failed to maintain their septic systems. And they propagate these problems, often unknown to the people that live there, into the estuary. A number of years ago now, probably a decade, the Chesapeake Bay program sponsored an extensive cooperative study which looked at modern development patterns around the bay, and they used data from the 1990 U.S. Census, which included questions about the wastewater systems citizens use, including septic tanks. Potential overall nitrogen load from septic systems was subsequently estimated at about 33.4 million pounds annually, and about 23.7 million pounds, about 71% of that, partitioned into groundwater, and about 8.75 million pounds to surface water. In other words, just sort of flowing on along in surface water and pouring out into streams. The remainder, nearly 1 million pounds, goes directly into the coastal zone, coming out of the cliffs and banks along our watercourses. The largest proportion of these estimated loads, a bit over a third, was calculated to come from Pennsylvania, about 29% from Virginia, and 25% from Maryland. There's a little bit of residual if you add those numbers up, which are believed to be from houses in urban situations that are still using septic systems not connected to municipal sewers. More than a fifth of the houses in the entire watershed, 64,000 square miles, were built before 1939. This probably says a lot about overall septic performance in these places. An irony of this is that while the last stage of failing septic systems, where the drain field is plugged with solids and you get black water oozing up out of the ground in your yard, can prove a health hazard, the switch from anaerobic metabolism, where the wastes are buried down in the soil and have no oxygen, to receiving oxygen when they come up and are exposed to the air, actually removes more nitrogen from the effluent than the system when it was operating properly. Some colleagues have put this discovery to good use. The septic system study I'm talking about found that outside the reach of municipal sewer systems, sprawl development into rural areas, read that Calvert County, generated virtual rings or belts of high septic system density. Richmond, Virginia showed this most dramatically. There's similar regions where you have more than 75 tanks per square kilometer, that's 194 per square mile, that were developing along the bay's more popular residential tributaries, the next up around Baltimore and down toward Annapolis, Anne Arundel. And here, where they're dangerously close to natural waters, increased nitrogen was getting into groundwater. There's also the potential for exceeding the land's capability for removing phosphorus. I remember I mentioned that to you a minute ago, which septic systems generally do pretty well. Now, while passage through long groundwater paths and metabolism, if it goes through a forest along the edge of a stream, reduce actual nitrogen delivery, this is unlikely in waterfront development because the bay is too close. The problem's not a short-term one either, as recognized by this guy George Simmons at Virginia Tech. There's a USGS study, Geological Survey study, by Judy Denver, in which she's looking at wastewater nitrogen that's traveled for 20 years in groundwater and it's just getting to the bay now. So even if we changed treatment and stopped the loadings of these materials into the soil today, the memory of past and current practices would continue haunting us for decades. Of course, we haven't stopped or even slowed down. I've looked at these patterns for the last 30 years, and I believe that development very close to the bay has a disproportionately bad effect relative to that farther inland. And these sites are often the ones that are most sought after for development purposes. Even where legislation like Maryland's Critical Areas Law and Virginia's Chesapeake Bay Protection Act seeks to protect sensitive land, clustering homes along the shoreline where the really valuable waterfront lots are, and then protecting acreage back inland, can put the drainage fields where their impact is quickly delivered to the adjacent stream or the adjacent bay. To me, as a tool illuminating reality, this septic system study was one of the most provocative and least publicized efforts of the whole Chesapeake Bay program. The effect of the effects they discovered and explained were also most strongly connected with development patterns around the bay and tributaries. The red areas here are the high population areas. And many observers look forward to evaluating the same kind of data from the next round of census in the year 2000. But there was a great deal of acrimony in Congress on this subject, and the questions on wastewater treatment were removed from the 2000 census. The reasons were given to ease the burden on responding citizens so they didn't have too much paperwork. The reality was political. This is hot stuff. If you start talking about damaging the environment close to water and making people recognize that it's not good to do this. Now, many state, regional, local jurisdictions around the watershed do not assemble this type of data, or they don't even have it in machine-readable form, so that prospects for updating the study are very slim. So we march on unimpeded to establish new ranks of toilets throughout the watershed. A traditional outhouse is not an aesthetic alternative for modern sensibilities, save for this hunter who needs only to lean out the door for some pre-season target practice with that fake deer. But in preparing this talk, I drove a couple of 100 miles down Maryland's eastern shore and enjoyed greatly the search, which turned up many of these traditional homestead necessaries that you've seen. Once outside the relatively developed areas around Cambridge, we found on the average an outhouse, sometimes 2 or 3, every 11.7 miles. I was surprised at their abundance, and I'll be looking for more as I travel. If you know of any, I'd like to hear about them in this county. Most people outside municipalities in the septics in the Chesapeake Basin don't have outhouses. They use conventional septic tanks and thousands of conventional toilets already marketed by Home Depot and more chic bathroom-oriented boutiques. There are, however, some alternatives I'd like to suggest for the thoughtful resident. For sites remote from treatment facilities, some different paths to follow than through the septic tank and drain field. The pilot programs like those with relatively areas with relatively shallow water tables, particularly some work by Rich Pillock in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, which take the septic system one step further and using a reactor chamber and filter bed, remove a significant amount of nitrogen before the effluent enters the drain field. As an aside, human urine production actually generates a little too much moisture for efficient composting. This, I think, is really funny. Ed Pillock's colleague, Ed Peters, is working on a sort of self-tipping privy component that acts as what he describes as a pee-poop separator. I can't wait for a slide of that. That is really a very Clementics dinner lecture. Other systems collect the waste from a number of dwellings and treat them on site with a significant nitrogen reduction, usually with some residuals that have to be transported to a wastewater plant for composting and stuff at other distances. The third approach follows a path, not the path of the back house, but one pioneered by Reverend Mould back in 1860 with self-contained composting toilets. A number of these are now on the market, and many Chesapeake residents concerned about the Bay's future have visited overnight educational facilities operated by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and their big facility up at the Merritt Building in Bay Ridge, South Minneapolis. Those visitors become completely familiar with the Clivus Multrum, its trademark composting toilet. It's essentially a drop privy, and this is not one, but I'll describe it in a minute, with a seat on the second floor of an open shaft, at the base of which waste slowly accumulate together with small amounts of wood chips, which the user adds as a carbon source. Again, a garden-compatible fertilizer is a result harvest after about a year. Now, this is the one at the Nature Education Center at Nanjemoy, Maryland, part of Charles County's educational system. It's a more technically complex system because it serves the visiting public as part of a life learning program reaches many hundreds of school children annually. There's a new installation, which I haven't visited yet, and therefore don't have a photo of, this similar product in Calvert County, Maryland, in Dunkirk. Now, for summer cabins and primary residences of the future, from anywhere within 1 to 4 principal occupants, composting toilet system are being miniaturized and really beautified. Not quite enough to get my wife to agree that we need one, but she said I could use it. But manufacturers in Canada and the U.S. from New York State and Pennsylvania put out competing units, some with heaters to maintain bioreactions in cold weather for like a little cottage that isn't occupied, a tumbling apparatus that stimulates aeration and rapid breakdown, or fans to carry away decomposition odors. Others simply allow nature to take its course and have a solar-powered air vent. Some units have been in place for at least 14 years with pretty good consumer satisfaction. There's even a version for boaters who have interest in this kind of technology, which has been approved for shipboard use by the U.S. Coast Guard. It's the ultimate no discharge. You simply carry it with you till the end of the season. All these units have essentially no plumbing, use no additional water except that in the deposit of waste, and many require no outside source of electrical energy. They have a lot to recommend them to far-sighted Bay watershed residents who are willing to take responsibility for their own waste. And perhaps one of the similar remarkable units constitutes a workable approach to minimizing development impacts near the estuary and the tributaries. If nothing else, the personal and family commitment that's necessary to use and maintain this would winnow down the pack to people who really care about their impacts. For the present, I'm afraid that the Chesapeake and American society is largely stuck in the long-term parking lot as far as new ideas are concerned in this area. And I'd like to thank you very much. Challenging question, sir.
You mentioned that you couldn't figure out, you wouldn't think that a place like a two-holer would be a good place to carry on business. But as you mentioned later, the Romans had maybe 25 or 30 in a room. And one of the interesting things I learned is that, of course, with the absence of toilet paper or corn cobs, they had a little stream of water running in front, and they would dip their left hand into it and clean themselves. And that led to the practice that whenever you shook hands, it was always with the right hand.
There's another side to that. They have found in archaeological excavations wipers that were carried in there in your garment, which was sort of like a little bottle brush thing, and you just sort of rub things and then you rinse it in the stream. So there are a lot of variations to that left hand, right hand thing.
Because I know when I was growing up, my mother used to say, talking about doing a business, like the dog would go do its business. And I wondered if that meant that, refers back to the Romans, that they actually carried on business matters in the privy.
There are some jokes about that. An organist, for example, discussed a tough piece. You ought to keep me clean here, but Evelyn, you had a question.
In reference to the modern privies that you're talking about, what happens to the
Well, they're true composters, and they, supposedly reach a proper temperature and whatnot. And the drying, the loss of moisture, the composting, the lack of bacterial substrate and stuff like that, seems to do the job pretty much. And it comes out to be not much different from the municipal compost that we can buy, Compro and other brands. Incidentally, for someone who's really interested in the modern toilets, I have a little bit of literature, only one copy of each, and a couple of the addresses for these companies for people who might be putting together a summer hunting cottage or something like that. So, somebody else? You've had enough. Dr. Paul.
Well, you might want to talk a little bit. You talked about the urban experience of Baltimore City and laws that were passed over the time, efforts to deal with this. I remember when I was a kid growing up with a Patapsco, when they dumped sewage straight into the Patapsco, the first step to clean it up was to put a pipeline all the way down the Patapsco Valley and then take it halfway out to the Chesapeake Bay and dump it all in the middle of the bay. This is the 1960s.
Yeah.
And then they finally decided, oh, it might be good that instead of dumping it out in a pipeline in the middle of the bay, is to actually build a sewage treatment plant in that big pipeline.
And it didn't do a very good job in Back Creek for a long time. It was virtually without oxygen. Now with modern wastewater nutrient removal primarily, which controls the growth of the algae that leap up after after the wastes are put in the water, oxygen is improving in Back Creek. It's one of the kind of success stories. It's interesting that Abel Woolman, who was up and through my time a professor at Johns Hopkins University, was a functioning scientist and a brilliant man into his 90s. And he was one of the first people to go out on the river and look at these problems back in 1913, 1916 time frame as a real young guy. And he lived through the whole process of this wastewater system development. And it's quite a life story on his part. Interesting man, neat guy. Yes, ma'am.
Do you happen to know how many outhouses are still functioning in this county? Because a few years ago, I had a student who lived only several miles from where we're sitting right now, who did not have running water and did have to use an outhouse. And the other students in my class were astonished. They couldn't comprehend that somebody didn't have a toilet to go to in their house and didn't have running water. So I would.
Yeah, it's kind of a.
And that's very. I mean, that's just. I'm talking a few years ago.
Yes, indeed. Well, I know there's an outhouse right now on Solid Wharf Road, but there's some. Maybe Jenny or somebody could help us. There's a program that I think the county brings job site Johnnies to houses that have that problem, and they rotate them. I've seen a pickup truck coming with a new Johnny and take away the old one. I was told by a Maryland state official about a year and a half ago that there are 10,000 privies in Maryland. And I don't know where to find them. It would be interesting because some of them are probably classics and should be photographed. Ralph did a hunt with Dwight Williams a number of years ago to find the privy for the Drumcliff Lighthouse, which is a garter road that drops into the bay. And he succeeded in that. Asked me if I wanted to slide in that, and I do. But I can't give you a number for Calvert County. I'm not sure the county wants that publicized, but I'd like to have it.
There was a piece in the newspaper some years back featuring somebody on the, that was still
somebody on a program.
Well,
a portrait. But I'd like to get more information on that. Yes, ma'am. Kirsty.
Actually, you can query the census. The last time I did, Jen, maybe you've looked at this for the last census, but I remember querying it in 1999. In Calvert at that time, there were 315 or so houses without indoor plumbing.
That's very interesting. So the number purportedly is 315. That would have been 1990 data, I guess, Kirsty, huh?
That's right. And I'm sure there are fewer now, but I would guess it's still over 100.
Yeah. I've only found one that did not appear to be in use. It's up in Sunderland. And it's just an antique sitting in the yard, like ours is. But Tom Wisner.
Ken, I'm reminded of a story. It's very short.
Yes. You want the microphone? Sound off.
It's a good story and it's short, and I never have the opportunity to tell it. It's one of my favorites.
Put him on the mic.
Because I think you would enjoy having it. It's a good story for you.
This is all we'll do, Tom.
Put into your stuff. It's Captain Alex Kellum of Crisfield, Maryland, Smith Islander, had this wonderful deep brogue that it was just wonderful to hear him tell stories. Alex was quite bright, a very intelligent man. And he, at one point, aspired to being a journalist. He went to Chicago, and he changed his name to Alex Hicks. And this great, I think it was the Chicago Tribune that he was interested in. And they said, well, you know, he said, I'd like to work here at this paper. And they said, well, there's no way that you're going to get to get up there and talk to Mr. Cobb, who is the editor of this paper. He said, oh, I can get that. And he just, you know, being this Eastern Shore boisterous fellow, he went up that elevator and went right into Cobb's office, and he said, Mr. Cobb, said, I want to talk to you. He said, what are you doing here? He said, well, I just want to talk to you. I want to interview you. He said, Cobb says, well, what is your name? He says, I'm Alex Hicks. Cobb said, well, do you know what we do with Hicks here in Chicago? Alex said, no, sir, I don't, but I sure do know what we do with Cobbs back there on the east side.
Can you believe that one?
Alex loved the fellow.
Oh, it's great. Yes, Captain Bailey.
Talking about the islands, Tangier and Smith Island have very high water tables, and I just hadn't thought about how do they handle their sewage. They don't have treatment plants there.
Well, they do now. That was a program that EPA did maybe, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, maybe a little more, to put treatment facilities in, I think, both Smith and Tangier. And they just upgraded one of them. They're not economically practical, you know, they're expensive to run for such a small community, especially the piping, because there's no downhill for the stuff to run. But that clearly was done, certainly when we first went out to Smith Island, we went right in the water, right in the ground table, water table.
The picture you showed at Nanjamoy of that great big metal unit, the toilet is actually up above it, isn't it?
It's the second floor, yeah.
Yes, that wasn't clear, I was thinking.
Yeah, well, it's the same pattern as a Clivus Multrum, where you sit on the second floor and it drops. It's a drop privy, very much like the old papers. But this gives you cellar basement access for the movement of the materials and whatnot.
Well, these names, Clivus and so forth, they associated with the person who developed them?
I don't know. It's a brand name. And I wrote them for literature and tried to get slides, and they sent me some little piece of junk.
So that large thing at Nanjamoy is not a Clivus?
No, it's the same general principle. It has some sort of a mixing apparatus in there so that, you know, you get blending of the materials so they get good composting reaction. Question back there, sir.
Okay. I was wondering, isn't the problem much more serious where the wastewater treatment plants are overflowing? I know that within the last 6 months or so, we've had this problem locally into the bay, you know, and this water, sewage has not been treated, I assume, before it just heads right on out from the water treatment plant into the
When a
water.
failure occurs, you're exactly right, and this is a true short circuit of the system, and it's a very powerful long-term shock to the system. And of course, if your beaches are open at that time, there's a very wet year, of course, that you had some rainfall infiltration problems and things like that. The problem with a lot of modern wastewater treatment facilities are that they do fail. They're engineering products, and they can make them run. I was told, well, Ralph and I were at a meeting last night with Bernie Fowler and Walter Boynton, who's, I think, the best ecologist in Chesapeake Bay, said that experts believe they could run treatment plants to get down to 1 milligram nitrogen, was about what you would find in a natural stream during the spring runoff period. That's extraordinary. The best plants now are running at about 3 or 5, and ones that have modest treatment are running at 15. So that 15 times as much nitrogen coming out of many small treatment plants as would have been in the natural streams leading into the water. But when these things fail, they all put out 15, 20 parts per million, plus the solids, plus the pathogens, plus you know, materials like paper and plastic materials that go right into water. And it's a serious problem. We depend upon technology to fix the problem, and it fails us many times.
Are you talking about capacity, that they're simply not large enough to handle when
Well, there are all
heavy?
kinds of reasons. Treatment plant operators want the plant running at full capacity. It's most, quote, efficient at that point. Their dollar per, you know, dollar efficiency is high when the plant is running near capacity. Communities want plants below capacity so they can grow. And the problem is that the bigger you get, the tighter you run, the tighter the margin you run with, the worse the failure. When I first, I spent 4 years working around Blue Plains with the District of Columbia government, And one day while we were there, they had a rain event, and the wall, the whole primary treatment and secondary treatment facility collapsed, just like a big, like one of these things in an earthquake. And 2.5 million gallons of sewage came pouring out, and it was a disaster for the river, just an awful mess. It took them a long time to clean that up. So it happens at the most technologically advanced plants. Of course, Governor Ehrlich is arguing to improve the quality of treatment. Fully support that. It's a very good objective because when they work, they do remove more nutrients. The more you get out, the better we are for the bay. The problem is that this capacity and this efficiency will be used to expand the number of people in the bay. And we're way over capacity now. We cannot fix Chesapeake Bay with the number of people that are here. And you don't want to hear that, but it's true. Bailey?
One of the interesting things, we just replaced our washing machine. And the new front opening ones, if you ever do have to replace them, they get about 20 years old or so. Front opening ones, where they have a rotating drum, use a very, about half or a third of the water, and that much less soap also.
Yep.
The amount of soap you consume for each wash is just like a third of what we use.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So it's something to keep in mind as you are upgrading your appliances.
Certainly for new building, you should use, did you hear the comment he was saying about a front loading washer? The ones that have the drum horizontally. You open a round door, it's got a porthole in it. Ours was about $600, but it does indeed use, it automatically weighs the laundry and adds the right amount of water too. And it uses just a quarter of a cup of detergent. If you put too much in, it overloads it, and it's really very efficient. And I don't know over 20 years whether we really save any money doing it, but it's sure, I mean, we go for months and months on a bottle of detergent.
Do you still eat oysters, Ken?
I never have, Tom. I never have had oysters.
Well, speaking of eating, we do have some refreshments in the back, so provided by the town of North Beach and Stacy, so please help yourself. And thank you, Dr. Ted Mountford.